Hey, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, SPC 209. I am once again Victor McInnes, your interpersonal communications instructor, coming to you live on tape from the campus of Aiken Technical College here in the bustling metropolis of Graniteville, South Carolina. Please remember, Aiken Technical College, your number one choice for higher education in Aiken County. Hey, listen, class, today we're moving on to chapter 2. Wow, my glasses are dirty. We're moving on to chapter 2. Chapter 2 is, you're going to see as we go through the lecture and as you read the text, which I know you're doing. Chapter 2 this is going to show you that we're going to be working from two sets of information here. Yes, my lectures are going to follow along with the textbook in general terms as far as structure of the course is concerned. But as you probably saw last week with chapter 1, there's going to be a lot of information in the book that I don't cover in the lectures because you can read, I presume, and you can learn it that way. And there's going to be a lot of stuff that's not in the text that will be in my lectures, okay? So you need to make sure you're both watching the lectures and taking notes and reading the textbook, okay? And again, as I'm sure you all know by now, the textbook is online and it's free to you because I'm a good guy. All right, so what we're going to start talking about today in chapter 2 is communications and perception. Communications and perceptions. We're going to start off talking about something that you're probably never going to hear of again, but I think it's really important for you to sort of understand the philosophical framework that goes into a lot of our communication studies. And we're going to be talking about, for a few minutes here, phenomenology. Phenomenology. And it's a real thing. I'm not making that word up. Phenomenology studies the structures of conscious experiences experienced from the first person point of view, along with relevant conditions of experience. Okay? Now this was thought up by a guy named Edmund, let me make sure I spell his name right because he's Austrian. Husserl. Yeah, that's an L on the end, which we people who speak English have a little trouble with. Now, Dr. Husserl came up with the idea of phenomenology. Let me see. You guys are going to be able to see that with all that glare? Oh, yeah. Stands out brilliantly. Phenomenology. What Professor Husserl thought of, came up with the idea he propounded, advocated, was that there is no single objective truth or objective reality. That we all engage our reality separately, and it is through our perceptions that we define our own realities. Okay? It was a build-up on some things that go, again, all the way back to Aristotle and Plato and Socrates. But this concept that there is no single reality was breathtaking to philosophers in the early 20th century. It was expounded upon. It was it grew very quickly, and then it became another one of those studies that became very prominent after World War II, like we talked about. Because how could a developed Western democracy like Germany suddenly throw itself into a fascist cause like they did at their own destruction? What was the logical reason for that? And a lot of people look to phenomenology, that there was no reality for the German people. They all perceived what they felt like they should perceive, and how they came to those perceptions were what drove that. It kind of fell out of favor. Nobody really talked about phenomenology after those initial years after World War II until the 1980s and the 1990s, when a lot of people were saying that we are embracing technology at such a fast rate to bring order to our perceptions. Technology makes our perceptions make sense. It brings order to the world. It makes everything equal. It's a level playing field for everyone. Clearly, in the last 10 to 15, probably 20 years, that's kind of fallen by the wayside, because now most of us, certainly a large number of us, feel that technology is bringing chaos to our perceptions of the world. And where our perceptions now, where it used to be in the 80s and 90s, where technology was beginning to unify our perceptions of the world, now our perceptions are fragmented. We can't even agree on what reality is anymore. And everyone, it now has a place where they can go find their own reality and have that reality reinforced. We talk about phenomenology because that way we need to make very clear that our perceptions are very important. Okay, it defines who we are and how we engage with our culture, our living conditions, our society. All of that comes from our perceptions. And what we're going to start talking about today is how our perceptions dictate and drive how we communicate with others. Okay? All right, so let's start talking about perception. Perception. Now, the textbook says perception is the process of selecting, organizing, and interpreting our experiences. Okay? The process of selecting, organizing, and interpreting our experiences. Three basic parts. Let me move this up a little bit so I have room. Perception. Okay? Is how we select, organize, and interpret our experiences. Now, the textbook actually says, instead of experiences, it says information. I don't agree with using the word information in that definition, because information, I think, is a limiting word. I think experiences would include information that we come in contact with. Okay, you read a book, that's an experience. You watch the news, you read an email, those are experiences. But if we say information and limit it to information, you know, my looking out that window and seeing that it's a sunny day outside is an experience. That's, you know, we would not necessarily perceive that as being information. So I define it, change just that one last word, the process of selecting, organizing, and interpreting our experiences. So one of the first things we're going to talk about is the experiences have to get through perceptual filters. Okay, we can't experience everything. All right, we can't even experience everything that we're exposed to. We'll talk about that in just a second. The interpretation of new experiences is always based on previous experiences. It's very rare once you get over a certain fairly young age that you're really truly experiencing something for the very first time. I saw a thing yesterday online where a young lady who had been paralyzed in an accident. She had been a big runner before. She needed some new exercise to help. She was doing a lot of weightlifting, but it was beginning to have a negative impact as weightlifting oftentimes does. So she needed a new exercise. So she decided to go swimming. And as she was paralyzed from the chest down, that took a lot of training. She had not been a big swimmer before, but for the first time, and this happened a couple of days ago, she was able to take herself to the pool, put herself in the water, swim, and then recover and get out of the pool and get back into her wheelchair all by herself. And she asked the rhetorical question, when was the last time you did you did something for the very first time? And I had to think about it. You know, I turned 60 in a couple of months. There's very little that I'm doing new now, and I think that's one of the challenges is for us to continue to do new things. But even when we do new things, we contextualize it in terms of old things that we've done that are kind of similar. Okay? So interpretation of new experiences is based on previous experiences, even though they may not be exactly similar. Okay, first of all, there's 3 steps to perception. First of all is selection. We cannot experience everything that we're exposed to. So the first step is focusing on a select subset of incoming information. Okay? My wife and I have this discussion all the time. When my kids are present, it's even worse. How can you be watching TV where we all agree to watch a movie, 15 minutes into it, somebody's on their phone? And Two of us will laugh and the third one doesn't. How can you possibly focus on your phone and on the TV set? Okay? We are constantly bombarded with incoming stimuli. We choose what we interpret, which is the second step, or the third step. We'll get to organize in just a second. Okay? So selection is choosing. That's about right now. Get rid of that. Choosing what we want to perceive. Okay? Now, the one thing you need to know about this is we choose based on salience. Salience. Salience is the degree to which something attracts or grabs your attention. Okay? Now, all the time, you're driving down the road, there are billboards all over the place. I mean, I used to live in Florida, and I had to drive up here when we were moving. I had to drive a long stretch of I-95 in Georgia, and there is nothing but billboards every, 45 yards for 200 miles. Hundreds of them. You stop seeing them after a while. They have to really do something to grab your attention and to make it salient for you to look at. Now, two of the cues that really grab our attention pretty quick are, number one, visual cues, and number two, auditory cues, something we can see or something we can hear. Okay? Written, just black type on a white text, especially depending on the size of the font, really doesn't grab our attention. Best example I have of that was they finally got in disinfecting wipes at Sam's the other day over in Augusta. So I grabbed me two of them. I didn't want to be greedy. I grabbed two of them. Got up to the front, and I scanned the second one, and they said, it's a minimum of one. I went, well, it would have been nice if it said that. Well, and the lady said, well, it did, but I'll take that one. Okay, well, it wasn't like I was taking it back. I then found out the next week when I went back that indeed there was a maximum of one per customer sign there. It was in about 12-point font, buried in the middle of all the information for the product. Okay? It did not achieve salience. Okay? We pay attention to things that mean, and the primary reason, the thing that gives salience are needs and interest. We give salience to things that meet our needs and interest. We select, okay? A lot of times these needs are reinforcements of our own perceptions. We will give salience to stimuli that reinforces our own perceptions. We may select stimuli that counters our expectations because it is jarring. It is surprising. Okay? Last week, Arnold Schwarzenegger put out a video about political issues. I sort of clicked on it, started listening to it. It was jarring how intelligent and how cogent Arnold Schwarzenegger's ideas were, how he presented himself. Now, you didn't have to agree or disagree with it, and I won't tell you whether or not I did or didn't. But the fact that Arnold Schwarzenegger was saying these incredibly intelligent things and well delivered and well thought out was very jarring to me based on my experiences with Arnold Schwarzenegger. So I gave it salience. Something in the middle between something that reinforces our already known perceptions and something that is really jarring and goes against our known perceptions, that stuff in the middle is not going to be picked up on. We're not going to give that salience because it's not going to do enough to reinforce us and meet our needs and interests, and it's not going to be enough to really make us rethink what our current positions are. Okay? So step one is selection of the stimuli that we will pay attention to. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to organize. We group our experience together in structures that we have already formed. All right? You see a man and a child in a restaurant or in a mall, walking down the mall. Okay? You see the child is holding hands with that man. There is another man walking next to them less than a foot, about a foot away, or 18 inches. We immediately go to the fact that that is a father and son, or most of us would, that's a father and son. We would not go to the fact immediately in many cases, and again, I have had to react to this and examine my own schema, and we'll talk about that in a second. We would not automatically think that that is a same gender couple and their child, that they are both the child's father. We don't think that way. We expect parents to be of two genders. It would not, how am I saying this? We group those experiences together and assume that it is a man with his child. We see a number of people standing in a line. Okay? And we immediately assume that they're organized. I have seen people do this. People will be walking around, especially it happens in like Disney World. They'll get in line. They have no idea what they're doing in line for, but if we perceive that if people are standing back to back, they're there for a purpose. And our organizational databases tell us people standing in a long line must be good when it's at the end. We assume that if we see a loose group of people and 7 of them are of one ethnicity and 2 people are of another ethnicity, we assume there's 2 groups, one of 7 and one of 2. We don't necessarily go to the fact that they're the same group of 9. So these preconceived notions aren't always bad. All right? And you're clearly thinking right now of experiences, and I've already mentioned race. I've already mentioned sexual orientation. You've already begun to realize that some of these can be inappropriate and can be bad. But this is how we teach our children about dangerous things. We teach our children that if you see a lone male in a white van and he wants to talk to you, you just run like hell. And that's a good thing. I had a friend of mine when I was living down in Florida. He was an air conditioner repairman, and he had a big white Ford Econoline van. And he said that anytime he pulled up outside of his school, people just lost their minds. And he said he had an appointment to go into the school, and the school had told him don't come in before 12:30. Because they got there like 12:15. Here was a single man sitting in a white van in front of an elementary school. He said about 5 minutes after he pulled up, the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Department was there asking him what he was doing. And he opened the back of his truck and showed him several tens of thousands of dollars worth of air conditioner repair equipment. And they went, oh, okay, got it. But that's not a bad thing. Okay? They allow us to quickly assess situations. And again, our beverage today is coffee. Coffee in my War Eagle Law University mug. Okay? If you've been injured doing something before, you're going to very quickly recognize that, and you're going to go to that. So in my neighborhood, they've got there's a hill that they didn't design the storm drains properly. And the water just running down the hill was overpowering the storm drains and flooding people's yards. So the solution was they took these little asphalt bumps that are about that high, they're maybe 2 inches high, and they stick out into the street about 15 feet at an angle to sort of shift the water into the middle of the street so it moves further down the hill before it hits the storm drains. Okay? I was riding my bicycle one day, it was hot, I was having a drink, wasn't paying attention. Hit one of those little 2-inch bumps. The bicycle went left. I went right. I landed on my elbow. Had to have dislocated my shoulder. Had to have anyway. Got a big scar right here where they did the surgery. Now I will tell you, I see any little bumps on the road. I am more than aware of where they're at, well in advance, and I steer away from them, and that's good. Okay. Driving the roads around Kabul, Afghanistan, I got very attuned to things that could be dangerous to us. And recognizing them quickly and not having to think. You think that box on the side of the road could be a problem? It's just that box on the side of the road is a problem. Putting it out to the driver. But we have to constantly review our organizational schemes. Organizing is something we have to constantly question and constantly review. Okay? Because yes, there is a thing called confirmation bias. We're going to talk about it a little bit later. If you don't question those organization, how you organize the data, you're going to repetitively come to the same conclusions over and over again, even if those conclusions aren't correct. Okay? I'm not going to make I won't hide it. If you find that I'm advocating it too much in class, please shoot me an email and we'll talk about it. I'm a soon-to-be 60-year-old white male who lives in the upper middle class. Okay? Everybody in my neighborhood is shocked, or was shocked, when 2 years ago I put out a Stacey Abrams for governor sign in my front yard. There's a guy who lives down the street, fellow Auburn grad. We chat occasionally. Rolled his window down. So what the hell is that? And I went, it's an Abrams for governor sign. He's going like, you can't be a Democrat. And I went, well, I don't think that's a law. I can be a Democrat. He was like, ugh, and he just drove off. 2 days later, he put a big ass Brian Kemp sign on his front yard. Okay? But people see me in their organizational, when their prior experience says that a 60-year-old white male is probably going to be a Republican. And I shock them when I'm not. It's jarring, so they give that salience. And I guarantee you, that neighbor down the street does not remember my name. I know for a fact he doesn't remember my name. My name was not salient to him. But the fact that I'm a Democrat, that he remembers. That he does remember because that was jarring for him. It got salience. The last thing we're going to do is we're going to interpret things. Let me move this up a little bit. My spelling is horrible and I all the time question my own spelling skills. Okay? Now when we organize things, we put them into what are called schema. Okay? The plural of schema is schemata. Now, a schema is a model for placing data into a category. It's really sort of a mental database. It's where you're going to file information. Everybody who has email has that list of files over on the side. Mortgage company, bank, Aiken Tech, family, vacation, where you put your email so you don't have a stack of 33,000 emails you have to search through every time you want to find that email from the email from the bank. Okay? Schemata is doing that in your head. Okay? Think of it as a database for you to easily organize and categorize your perceptions. There's nothing wrong with schema. We use them all the time to organize our lives. But be aware that if you are forcing in the organization, where you put that information and what schemata is going to drive how you interpret the events of your life. Okay? The schemata I have, the schema I have, that has caused me, not really bad issues, but has caused me, I've had to sort of back away kind of quickly. Okay? Fans of the University of Alabama football. I grew up in North Alabama. I'll be honest with you, if you've seen Coal Miner's Daughter, that is my mother's family. Okay, there are literally a bunch of coal miners, or they were before the coal industry died out in Alabama. They're very loud, very ill-informed, very overbearing Alabama fans. And as a two-time Auburn graduate, you can imagine where I come down in where I fit in their schema. Okay? So I grew up with a very bad perception of Alabama fans. Now, throughout my adult life, through my professional career, I had multiple bosses that were University of Alabama graduates. Everybody wanted us to see me get pissed off at them. And originally, I kind of would. I would be a little aggressive in our friendly sparring. But then I began to realize that not every Alabama fan fits into that Alabama fan schema I had. So I can't just, okay, let me be honest with you, I still react poorly to Alabama fans. But I developed a separate schema that said Alabama fans who are also Alabama graduates. And if you're an Alabama fan and you're watching this, yeah, okay, all right. So we have racial profiling is a schema. If you're going to put any person of a certain age and ethnicity into a group and say this person is going to react this way, they are either a threat or an ally based on their ethnicity, that's a schema. We have that phrase, that cliche in our conversations, a leopard can't change its spots. That's because we will not allow people to move outside the schema we have placed them in. Okay? When I was in Afghanistan and Iraq, we had a phrase, we even shortened it to MAM, military-aged males. Any male between 18 and 60 was an immediate threat. Were they all threats? No. Was that an improper schema? No. Based on cost-benefit analysis, remember, needs and interests. We had to think of every military-aged male as being a potential threat because so many of them were, and the risk and the cost was so fantastic. Okay? So schema are not good or bad, they just are. It's how you use them and how often you're willing to challenge them that becomes the question. All right? So let's talk about how we perceive others. We all judge other people. Don't care. Don't say, well, I'm just not a judgmental person. Yeah, you are. Everybody's a judgmental person. We all have schema that we fit people into. Okay? It's human. It's not wrong. It's not bad. It just is. It's like the atmosphere is made up of nitrogen and oxygen or whatever. That's just a statement of fact. We judge other people. Okay? It's how we decide who will be our friends. It's how we decide who we will socialize with and hang out with. It's how we decide who to marry, who to date. It's how we decide who we'll trust. Okay? I had a student in my class said, well, I don't judge. She argued with me. She said, I don't judge people. I said, okay, let me ask you a question. Think about the last time you went out for a social evening. Okay? Don't give me any names. Just count them off. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Okay? Just give me the numbers. She said there were 4. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay? Said, I want you to think of another person that you see every day. She said, okay. And I said, why wasn't that person out with you on Friday night going to dinner? Well, because they wouldn't fit in with the group. And how did you come to that conclusion? Well, that was my judgment. She got a little annoyed with me. We all judge. It's okay. We all make decisions about other people and how we should interact with them. We do this through what's called attribution and interpretation. We've already talked about attribution. We've already talked about interpretation. Okay? We don't see events as being, we don't see people as being random. We assume that if somebody walks up to you and says something, we're going to attribute motivation to that. Now, there are 2 types of motivations and attributions we can make. We can make an internal. We can make an internal attribution. And an internal attribution is an attribution where we attribute the person's actions to their personality, to their innate qualities. So internal is personality driven. And you probably already jumped to the conclusion. The next type of attribution is external. External. Now, an external attribution is driven by a situation. Given our choice, we normally default to internal attributions. Was right along with a friend of mine when we got pulled over. A friend of mine, he was a captain in my unit. We were going out to dinner. We were driving along. He was driving his Mustang 5.0, which was a hot car in 1987. And he got pulled over by a local cop. And he was like, that guy's just being a jerk. I'm not going to repeat what he said because it would be unprofessional. His language was swift, profane, and opinionated. I mean, and he was calling this cop every name you could imagine. And finally, I just looked over and I said, you know, Captain, you were going 57 in a 35. Okay? But rather than interpreting that cop was just doing his job, he attributed it to the officer's personality. Okay? Back in the before times when I used to meet students in my office, I actually had a student come in and look at me and hand me her grading rubric and say, I think you were having a bad day. It's going like, why do you say that? You give me a 38 out of 75 on this speech. Clearly you were having a bad day. And I was going like, maybe, just maybe, you gave a bad speech. It was supposed to be 4 to 6 minutes long and you went 98 seconds. You didn't have a conclusion at all. You never took your hands out of your pockets. You stared at the floor the entire time. You didn't have it, and I just went through all the things they were sitting there going like, well, yeah, that was all not there, but still, I think you were a little harsh. Were you in a bad mood that day? Fortunately, I'm able to find these things humorous. Okay? But we will attribute things to internal motivations all the time. How many times do we have the argument about what causes crime? People say, poverty causes crime. That's situational. That's an external attribution. And then people will turn around and immediately say, yes, but you chose to commit the crime. Not everyone who is poor is a criminal, so it's got to be an internal attribution. Which is correct? The answer is yes. Again, there is no right answer here. It's just something you need to be aware of. The fact that you give an internal attribution is not a fact, like most people would like for you. The fact that you give it an external attribution is not a fact. These are all based on perceptions. Okay? But internal and external can both play a role. They both be vitally important. Both of my parents had addiction issues. Therefore, due to genetics, we now know my addiction probably ties back to my genetics. But if you have to choose to be sober, and you have to step up and take that on yourself. That has both internal and external attributions in it, and is a completely accurate reflection of that. Some of the other things that will impact our attributions, and we're not going to go into it a great deal right now because we're going to get into it a lot later. Culture affects how we build schema and schemata, as well as personality. And we're going to have an entire chapter on culture, and we're going to talk about personality off and on all the way through the entire class. Okay? So probably nothing affects and drives your perception, your perceptions. Well, nothing drives your communication. Okay, let me say this. I'll get it right the third time. Nothing drives your communication style and the way you communicate. No perception has more influence than your self-perception, how you look at yourself. So what we're going to talk about next is self-perception. Answer the question, who am I? Because not only do we use schema and schemata to organize our external world and how we engage the world, but we also use schema and schemata to identify how we think of ourselves. And by organizing into those schemata, we answer that question, who am I? There's a couple ways to do it. One is a looking glass theory. Or a reflection. We see ourselves in the people we hang out with or the people we're around, either in contrast to them or, we see them reflected back on us. Okay? You've seen this just about, this is the dramatic device in just about every teen movie you're ever going to want to see, especially a teen romance where the friends, what's the movie? I can't think of the name. But hey, you can't date that person because they're horrible and they're a social outcast. So the person hangs out with the in crowd at school until they suddenly realize the in crowd at school are a bunch of jerks. So that at the end of the movie, to applause and much uplifting music, they go over and sit at the nerd table. Because they realize the people that they're hanging out with don't reflect well back upon themselves. Okay? The other is what's called social comparison. Social comparison is where you evaluate your own self by comparing yourselves to others. Now, we do this all the time. We always compare ourselves to each other. Okay? The worst case I ever saw was at one time I had two fraternal twins. They were not identical twins. I had two fraternal twins in my class. And one of the fraternal twins was so hyper competitive, let me just say that, hyper competitive with her sister, that she used her mother's maiden name on the her enrollment documents. I didn't even know they were related until about halfway through the class, because they looked nothing like each other, even though they were twins. And the one twin was incredibly hyper competitive. I mean, she would immediately run, I would give back rubrics, and the next day, the next class, she would stop me over and say, hey, why did you give so-and-so this? And finally, I took the other person aside and said, what is the deal with this person, and why are they so attached to you? And why are they so basing how they perceive their success in this class based on whether or not they got a better score than you? She goes, oh, that's my twin sister. And I was like, what? And of course, even before FERPA and the laws prohibited, I said, I don't discuss other students' scores. I will tell you how you can improve your score, but I'm not going to tell you why you did better or worse than this other student. Okay? It is not uncommon. We hold up heroes all the time. I mean, we hold up heroes in our culture. Martin Luther King is the obvious example. We hold up sports guys. Okay? Hank Aaron grew up. When I was growing up, Hank Aaron was a god. When I was growing up, I got to meet the Apollo 11 astronauts one time when I was like 8 years old. The first mission to the moon. I met Neil Armstrong, I met Buzz Aldrin, I met Michael Collins. I was like, I couldn't speak for a week. We hold those people up. So these are virtues, and compare yourself to them and try to be like them. Okay? We also use it as, I'm better than that guy. I may suck, but I'm doing better than him. So when I went through basic training, there's a guy from Wisconsin. I had no idea what his name was, but I hated that guy. I've forgotten. It's been a long time. It's been 38 years. And I just could not, all I remember about that guy was what it looked like and the fact that I couldn't stand to be around him. And there were days, and I think everybody that goes through Army basic training, Marine Corps boot camp, Navy boot camp, not the Air Force, but the other services, there's that day when you think, that's it, I'm done, I'm going to quit. And there may be several days, because I was struggling with some of the other areas. I was, there were days when I just went, this was a bad idea, I just need to go home. But then I would look over at that other guy that I could not stand from Wisconsin, and for some reason I remember he's from Wisconsin, and very little else about the guy. And I kept telling myself, well, if he ain't going home, I ain't going home. And my self-comparison to him was, I have to be better than that guy, because he's a loser and I'm not a loser, and I have to be better than him. By the way, we both graduated from basic training. Thank God he made it through. If he quit, I don't know what I would have done. I owe him a debt of gratitude for that, and I've begun to realize that many, many years later, was that guy probably changed the direction of my life and never even knew it. Because if I'd have dropped out of basic training, don't know what I would have done with myself. Okay? So sometimes we compare ourselves to lift ourselves up or to keep ourselves distanced from other people. But that leads us to how we develop self-esteem. Self-esteem is where we make judgments and evaluations of who we are as a person. What kind of person am I? Okay? It defines our self-concept. Self-esteem may be the single most important thing in how we engage with the world. All right? I've known people that were absolutely brilliant, that had very low self-esteem and did not engage to the full extent that they should have. And in some cases, the world lost great talents because of these people's low self-esteem, because they just don't feel they should be engaging more aggressively. I've seen a lot of people who were just, way overestimated their importance and their abilities. Okay? So self-esteem is what kind of person I am through judgments and evaluation. Self-efficacy answers the question, can I do this thing? Whatever that thing is that you're doing, can I do this? And they're tied together. Self-esteem is sort of an internal judgment or evaluation of who you are as a person. Self-efficacy is how you actualize yourself in engagements with the world. Okay? So where do we get our self-esteem and our self-efficacy from? How do we form? Where do we get the data to put into the schemata that we call self-efficacy and self-esteem? Well, first of all, there's our families. Families don't always look the same. Families don't always engage each other the same way, but families are always, in some form or the other, our first social groups. And by social groups, I don't mean the people you like to hang out with. By social group, I mean the people that you wind up associating with, communicating with on a regular basis. Then we have non-family social groups. People that we choose to be with. Voluntary social groups, you might say. Okay? If you're in a social group that constantly builds you up, that constantly says, hey, you're great, that's a social group that's going to build your self-esteem and build your self-efficacy. If you're in a group that constantly rides you and breaks you down, either family or voluntary social groups, that's going to have an impact on your self-esteem and your self-efficacy. We'll mention this briefly because, again, chapter 8 is on nothing but this. There's culture. And then part of culture is media. Okay? And if you think media doesn't impact your self-esteem, there's way too many studies that say otherwise. I mean, the fact that eating disorders really weren't a problem until we television. It should be all the evidence we need for that. Okay? The media impacts everything we think about ourselves. I read no, I'm not going to get into that right now. Okay? In general, this is very important. We strive to present a public image that equals or matches our own self-concept. That the text says, your textbook says, in general, we strive to present a public image that matches our self-concept. I will tell you, I don't think that's true. I think we strive to present a public image that presents our idealized self-concept. We try to present an image that is what we want people to think of us, not what we actually are. Okay? Because I'm trying to think. And again, a good example, perfect example. I know my self-concept. When I started that sentence, I wanted to come up with a personal example of me and my self-concept that I don't want in my public image. And the first thing that popped in my mind was it's 11:45 on any given weekday night, and I'm sitting there with a bag of chips and some onion dip watching Modern Family in my sweatpants. That is not something I want everybody to see. That is not the public. You may have already thought that anyway, and that's fine. Okay, I'm not, yeah, I look like a guy who eats potato chips at 11:45 at night. Okay, but that's not the public image I want to portray. Given, in fact, I'll be honest with you, I have multiple public images, and we're going to talk about that later on as well. Because when I walk into a classroom, back in the before times when we had classrooms that people sat in, my demeanor, and some of my students over time have noticed, my demeanor the first day of class is radically different than it is later on in the semester. Because I want a public image that is an idealized version of myself as a college instructor. Okay? But the core of this, even if it's idealized, is who we think we are. And that drives our communication. This public image that we wish to portray is what drives our communication with other human beings. Okay? And I say with other human beings because I've had so many people say to me, and the only person I can be honest around is my dog or my cat. And I agree with that. Okay? So, let's talk about, let's wind up. A couple more minutes, a couple more points. I forget you guys are seeing this on YouTube, so there's a little time bar across the bottom whenever you want to see how much longer I'm going to be talking. Let's talk about how we improve our perceptions. First of all, we have to admit obstacles to perception, or to, and again, there should be a modifier here, and I struggle with this every time I give this lecture. I could say honest perception, but perception, if we go back to phenomenology, there is only perception, so it can't be true or false. Okay? Accurate perceptions, okay, maybe. But I would say that, how obstacles to perceptions that will allow us to engage our realities as effectively as we can. These are things you need to be aware of, traps you don't want to fall into. The first is selective exposure. Selective exposure. I just want to go see things I don't want to see. Okay? You know, there are movies about war that I will not watch because I just don't want to see them. Okay? My mother-in-law doesn't like the concept of urban areas at all. We can attribute that to a whole lot of different things, none of them positive. But when we were living in Maryland and they would drive from Vermont to Maryland, they would go way out into Pennsylvania so they wouldn't even have to see New York City, just because they didn't want to be exposed to it. Okay? I know people here in the CSRA that will not drive up Gordon Highway because they don't want to see the empty buildings and the empty strip malls and everything else. The indications of urban, I don't know if it's urban blight, but urban decay, suburban decay. Okay? Because they just don't want to see it. And if they don't see it, it doesn't exist. Right? I know people, it started with Reagan, but I know people now that when any story about racism in the United States comes out, they'll change the channel because they don't want to watch it. I don't want to see that. Okay? There is selective recall. We pull things out of those schematas to remember based on our voluntary perception. Yeah, that's voluntary. We choose to remember what we choose to remember. You ever have a fight with somebody and then when you read their word, you give them back what they said, word for word? They look at, I don't remember saying that. You play a tape recording of it, and they go, I can't believe I said that. Okay? We remember what we want to remember. We remember things that fall in line with the schemata we have already developed. There is our degree of commitment. Our degree of commitment. If you are all in for something, doesn't make any difference what you see that changes your mind. You're all in for that thing. Okay? There was a time a couple of years ago, I guess maybe going back 10 years now, there was I'm not going to mention his name, but there was a player at Florida State University that had, and I was living in Tampa, big Florida State Seminole country, and there were some really horrible things coming out about the athletic department. People didn't care. They're Florida State fans. Don't care. Horrible allegations against this individual, cover-ups by Florida State University Police Department, cover-ups by Tallahassee Police Department. Don't care. I'm a Florida State fan. That makes no difference to me. Okay? We've known of people like that. And then the other thing is going to be public statements. I will tell you that when I was 9 years old, my brother was the biggest Auburn University fan in the history of the planet. And because I was just hateful of my brother, for about 5 weeks, I was an Alabama fan. I knew nothing about the University of Alabama. I didn't care about the University of Alabama. What I cared about was pissing off my big brother, so I told people I was an Alabama fan. I got over it fairly quickly. To this day, I still hear about that. 50 years later, I still hear about that. One of the things my mother said relatively in days before she passed away was that, yeah, well, you were an Alabama fan at one time, okay? Once you make a public statement, I mean, you guys here in South Carolina, you ever know anybody that went from being a South Carolina fan to being a Clemson fan? No, because they're going to have to take all those South Carolina shirts and give them to Goodwill. They're going to have to take all them South Carolina bumper stickers off their cars and replace. Once you make a public statement of something, you're fairly well committed to it. So you need to be aware of the fact that just because you said something in the past doesn't lock you in for the future. You can't change your mind. It is legal in this country. Okay, last things. Couple pointers. Things to avoid. Or things to be aware of. Be aware is that if you're schemata are getting too rigid. Well, that person meets this criteria. You know, that's a person in a red hat. Everybody in a red. I thought I picked something random. Now people are going to be thinking I'm talking about Trump hats. That guy's wearing a blue hat. Everybody I see in a blue hat, he's a Dodgers fan. Everybody I've ever seen wearing a blue hat's a Dodgers fan. I hate Dodgers fans. Okay, I hate Yankees fans. But that guy's helping me change my tire. Maybe Yankee fans aren't all horrible. Don't let your schemata get too rigid. Okay? Be aware of socializing forces. Do I think this, or did everybody tell me I should think this? Is that my schemata, or is that schemata that somebody else told me I needed to have? Be aware of confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is where you have an idea and you only look for information that is going to confirm that idea, that is going to reaffirm your prior thoughts. Okay? Be empathetic. Be open to looking at things from the other person's point of view. Okay? Then finally, engage self-reflection. I think the greatest way to have engaged self-reflection is to have children. Because my children are more than happy to point out when I change my mind. Well, that's not what you said before. And I look at them and say, you know, my father always told me it takes a big man to admit he's wrong, and I'm a big man, I was wrong. Okay? So engage self-reflection, you know, again, avoid rigid schemata, be aware of socializing forces that are impacting you, avoid confirmation bias, be empathetic to other people, and then engage in self-reflection. Challenge those perceptions you have and the schemata you've built to organize data in your head. Right? That way you are accepting input and stimuli from people, and that way you can more accurately reflect what you need to and engage your outside world more effectively. Okay? That's chapter 2. You will see your discussion board should be posted about the same time this lecture goes up. So again, there will be a deadline posted on that discussion board. Email me if you have any questions about any of this. If you just want to engage in a conversation, hey, how does this impact that? I'd be happy to discuss it with you. If you give me a good question, I'll mention it before the next, at the beginning of the next lecture. When we start chapter 3, I'll go, hey, somebody asked this question, and I'll go over it. That's the way I work these online classes, okay? That's it. Don't forget to stay in touch. Don't forget to stay safe, and we will see you around.